Software Project Dynamics, so you could go and take a look at that. Meanwhile, we're going to start recording here. We'll get started. I'm expecting more people to kind of bleed in over the next 5 minutes from 371. Okay, so today's lecture, we're going to be continuing on a theme we started last time, talking about the methodology of system dynamics. You'll recall that we introduced system dynamics in class a couple lectures ago, and I noted, I guess most notably last time actually, talked about some features of it, and we noted that it had both quantitative and qualitative sides to it. During the last lecture, we saw some of the qualitative sides. So what sort of diagramming methodology did we see last time that has a qualitative feel to it? Causal loop diagrams, yeah. Now, I like to describe them as sort of semi-quantitative, or as it were, semi-qualitative. In what sense did they have a certain amount of quantification in them? What was the sort of element by which we could say they had some measure of quantitative elements included within them? Well, within those diagrams, what do we have associated with each link? We had a magnitudes. Yeah, so we had a polarity, right? Yeah, plus and minus, and from that from the polarity associated with individual links, we could deduce polarity associated with paths of links, and from that we could deduce polarity associated with loops. And speaking about the polarity associated with loops, we were able to reason about qualitative behavior associated with those loops. What were some of the qualitative behaviors that could be associated with loops? So if we had a positive feedback loop, a loop which involved reinforcement, where an initial change at one point in the loop led to a cascading series of changes that rippled around and amplified that original change. What sort of behavior was that associated with over time? Can anyone tell me? So if I were to draw out time here on the x-axis, as is going to be very common in this course, in the value of a variable in that loop, call it v, what would be the time behavior associated with this for a reinforcing loop? Yeah, it's an exponential growth. And we'll actually see at a mathematical level why this emerges, probably maybe next time with time beyond, why we see this sort of behavior in many cases. It's not a universal rule. There are some exceptions, but this is a very, very common behavior. And fundamentally, I mean, at an intuitive level, one can get a sense that there's amplification going on. Each time it goes around the cycle, there's more and more amplification. Each push on it in one direction ripples around and pushes even further in that direction, so you get this amplification. And it's much like that situation with the microphone and the speaker. It gets louder and louder and louder and louder, screecher, 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 and you know, at some point it maxes out the speakers. It saturates the speakers. So we can very easily get this situation where it takes off exponentially, and ultimately it's other aspects of the system that often limit it. So with a speaker, it's max volume associated with the speaker, or physical limitations. In other systems, it saturates because of other effects. But this is the effect associated with a positive feedback loop. How about a negative feedback loop? What we call a balancing loop. What sort of behavior was that associated with? Yeah, and it's sometimes it's exponential decay to zero. Think of a bathtub leaking water with an imperfect drain, and it drains out, and then that's it, and it's empty. In other cases, it's decay to some sort of situation where the system is at balance. And the decay may be upwards or may be downwards. And so it may approach some, as we call asymptote, approach some limit asymptotically. As time goes on, it approaches some limit. And what's notable about a bouncing loop is that it's stable. It resists change. So if you perturb it, so if you disturb it in some way, knock it off, again, it will sort of head back again towards that asymptote. Knock it off again, it will head back again. Quite similar to the behavior you see with capacitors, for example, if you've worked with electrical circuits. You see this sort of behavior associated with sawtooth waves sometimes when you excite them with charge going in, they then decay, etc. Decaying through a resistor, of course, in some sort of circuit. So anyway, here we saw some qualitative behavior associated with loops. One thing I didn't emphasize too much, but which is really notable, is that if you have a balancing loop with a delay, I mentioned it briefly, what's the dynamics associated with that? So if you have a balancing loop and it wants to get back to equilibrium, but there's a delay associated with it. Imagine driving, but all you could look at was a screen that shows what's in front of you 2 seconds ago. You overcompensate, and what does that tend to lead to? Oscillation, often damped oscillation that ultimately approaches it, but you overshoot and correct. You overshoot and correct, and you end up approaching some asymptotic limit often, but it's with this damping. Now, sometimes there's no damping. Sometimes the oscillations actually continue. There's a delay associated with perception, and you get the oscillations going on ad infinitum. In a surprising number of systems, human systems and physical systems exhibit this sort of oscillatory dynamics because of characteristic delays. Okay? There's delays in them, and it spans from infectious diseases to issues having to do with the business cycle, company ordering policies, etc. You get this sort of oscillatory behavior. At the level of biomedical systems, we see it in our body as it responds to medication. So these are some of the dynamics associated with these loops. And when we build up a causal loop diagram out of these loops, often we can visualize behavior associated with individual loops in isolation, and then we have to start reasoning about how they might interact together. And we saw some ways in which they interact together. For example, you may get a situation where you get a rise exponentially, and then you get a sort of overshoot and a damp out exponentially. This is associated with a positive feedback loop initially, and then a negative feedback loop as it damps down to 0. That's a possibility with a positive and negative feedback. In other cases, you could get a rise up and asymptote at some plateau. In the first case, this might be a situation where you're selling some item that people only want to buy once, and you look at the number of people who are buying it per month. Maybe it's the iPhone 5. So a given individual buys them, it becomes a hot item for a while, it rockets up, people tell their friends about how good it is, it sort of goes up as everyone and their brother is buying them, and then at some point it reaches a crest, and fewer and fewer people haven't bought them who are interested in buying them, and it declines. Other technologies succeed it. This other type, where it rises and plateaus at a level, might represent actually the integral side. So how many people have the iPhone 5 or have bought it, but it could also represent other situations where you have sort of a build-up and you reach some capacity of some long-term physical asset. So anyway, we started talking about the dynamics last time associated with these loops. And from causal loop diagrams, you can often get unexpected insights. Insights as to what factors affect many loops at the same time, which can be useful for making decisions. You can get some appreciation for where behavior comes from. That's useful. Today, we're going to start moving towards the more quantitative side of system dynamics with stocks and flows. And stocks and flows, we'll see, will be based on ordinary differential equations and admit to very rigorous types of analysis that will shed light on some of these patterns we've already seen with stocks and flows. Oh, sorry, excuse me, with causal diagrams. Okay, so I noted last time that with stock and flow models in system dynamics, there's a small modeling vocabulary, and the power really lies in combinations of few elements. We're going to be combining stocks, flows, and some supporting elements like auxiliaries and constants and so on. Okay. For those who don't have a laptop, if you could grab one from back there, it would be good, because we're going to be using some software just a little bit. Okay. So we're going to be talking today about stocks and flows at the first level and building up some basic intuitions with them. So the two elements of this vocabulary that are most important, the two critical elements, are stocks on the one hand and flows on the other. Now, stocks go by several names: levels, state variables, compartments. We call them different things in different sub-areas of related disciplines. In system dynamics, the preferred term is stocks. And at a basic level, these represent accumulations over time of some quantities that, for the sake of the model, you consider more or less interchangeable. And collectively, these capture the state of the system. And that's why they're called state variables in applied mathematics and in many areas of engineering analysis that would make use of applied math. The key features of stocks, as they capture the state of the system, they can be measured at one instant in time. We can reasonably talk about, how many developers are on our software development team right now. That may be changing over time as we hire people, as people leave or go on leave of absence or resign or what have you. But at any one time, we can exactly quantify how many people are on that team. We could ask, how many active bugs do we have? How many bugs are there that are known with confidence to be actual defects? We could ask about that, and we could estimate that at a point in time. Now, stocks within our models are going to start with some initial value, and thereafter they are going to only change via flows. Okay, so they start with a value, and their subsequent evolution is going to be dictated by the flows in and out of them. So whether they go up or down from that initial value is driven by the flows. Okay. Stocks are the source of delays within a system, and within a stock and flow diagram, they're going to be shown as rectangles. Okay. So within a diagram like this is a stock and flow diagram. Susceptible, infectious, temporarily immune people, and number of cumulative cases of illness. This could just as well be number of dollars spent. If we were to have a system in software development, we might have something like this, where we have known work remaining, undiscovered work remaining, and actually completed work. These are the stocks, okay? So there's some amount of work remaining, some amount of work we've actually done. There's some work we don't know what it is. We posit it's out there. Remember, these are models of sort of how things work, simplified version of how things work out there in the world. This is undiscovered work. We think there's some work out there, we don't know yet about how big it is, but we're going to discover it because we're going to discover defects, for example. Design defects, code defects, requirements defects. And that's going to require us to throw some work away and maybe do more work. And then maybe there's a stock of fatigue. How fatigued is the team? So these might be the sort of stocks which would be in a model related to software development. In any case, the stocks are shown as these rectangles. Levels, compartments is a common word for obvious reasons. Okay, so we're going to see that stocks then work hand in hand together with flows. The flows being these elements that go between them, that lead an individual, in this case, to say go from a susceptible state to an infectious state, or that lead an item of work to go from being known that it has to be done to being actually completed. Okay, that'll be some task, say that's completed. Okay, let's talk a little bit more though about the features of these stocks. Why are they so important? Turns out that they play an absolutely critical role in the dynamics. They determine the current state of the system, so collectively they specify the model state. If you wanted to stop the model at a point in time, save it away to disk and restart it later, it's the stocks that you'd have to save. That summarizes the state of the system. So the flows can be computed from the stocks. All you have to do is save away the stocks. That completely specifies the state of the system enough that you could restart it this time. Stocks and current time, what the time is. Stocks, moreover, though, are central to most disequilibria. So build-up, accumulation, delay, those sort of dynamics we saw over here of decay towards some equilibrium, of out-of-control growth, of oscillation, those are all reflections of stocks, as we'll see. Causal loops always have to involve at least one stock. Okay? Stocks lead to inertia, and partly because of that, they give rise to delays. They're the source of sort of why things often take a longer time than we expect to take place. It takes time to change things, to drain the stock. Drain the stock of mistaken understanding, build the stock of knowledge, or what have you. Okay, let's talk about state changes, though, flows. These are the other pieces of the equation. Stocks and flows work hand in hand, but flows are very different than stocks. All changes to stocks are going to occur via flows. The only way in which we're going to have work actually get accumulated is if there's work being finished, because there's a flow in from this flow right here. The only way that undiscovered work is going to be changing is either new bugs are being created and introduced, which leads to work that we think is completed, but there's actually undiscovered things in it, not yet discovered via testing, or testing shows that we've undiscovered work and reveals it so we can debug it, and then once we've discovered this defect, we put it in our defect repository, and it becomes known work remaining. It becomes work that we know has to be done. We have to fix this bug. The only way that happens is because that this changes, undiscovered work remaining goes up or down, is because these flows here, flows in, flows out. Okay, so flows are where it's at when it comes to stock evolution. They are the derivatives of the flow, of the stocks, excuse me. The flows associated with the derivatives of the stocks. If we sum them all up for a given stock, all the flows in it, and subtract out all the flows out, we get the derivative of that stock. Now, flows are always expressed as, in terms of units or dimensions, even at a more fundamental basis, they're always something per unit time. We're talking about some amount of people per unit time that are hired. The rate of hiring is people per unit time. Number of people per unit time, let's say. So maybe people per month that we hire onto our software development team. It may be number of people per month getting ill, what have you. If we have a stock that's measured as unit X, maybe it's people, then the flows in and out of the stock will be measured in people per unit time. Right? So if the stock is changing on the basis of these flows, number of susceptible people, if we think about the number of new infections, this will be some people per unit time if susceptible is measured in people. The stock is going to be the integral of that flow over time, it turns out, in this case, minus the flow out over time. And we're going to integrate up the flow times dt over some period of time. dt is measured in time times this flow, which is people per unit time. We're going to get people. We integrate it up to get susceptible. So unit-wise, we always are going to have if a stock is unit X, the flows into and out of it have to be of unit X divided by the appropriate time unit. Okay. Now flows are typically measured over some period of time. Okay. So when we measure a flow, we wanted to ask how fast the Saskatoon River is flowing in cubic meters per second. We typically are going to arrive at an estimate through that by measuring some change over some period of time, dividing by the time to get the change at an instantaneous basis. So if we were to want to measure cubic meters per second, we could put out a device which would measure fluid flow through some area, measure the amount of liters or cubic meters that flow within a certain period of time, divide by that period of time to get cubic meters per second, for example. So typically when we have flows, we measure them, as it were, by accumulating over some period of time and dividing by that length of time. It's very, very hard to measure flows at an instant in time in and of itself. It's typically very, very challenging. So here we might quantify, for example, bug fix rates as bugs fixed per week, incidence rates as accumulating number of people that have reported with flu over the course of a year. Or if we had an agile team for software development, we might measure our velocity, or so-called velocity of this team, how quickly it's getting its work done in jelly beans per day, where jelly bean is an estimated amount of work. It's sort of some unit of functionality commonly used in agile processes. So we can give here an estimate for the rate at a point of time, but typically we need some period of time to measure it, over which to measure it. And it's typically quite hard to just freeze right now. If you imagine taking the world in an instant in time and estimating how fast a car is going, it's very difficult to measure. It's at a certain point, and at a certain point in time, it's located at exactly one location. If you want to measure how fast it's going, you would measure where it is at two closely spaced periods of time. So maybe 1 second separated. If it's going about 80 feet, you're going about 60 miles an hour, something like that. Okay, so examples of flows, well, fluid flow, inflow and out of the bathtub, rate of bug fixes, rate of code production, number of incident cases, rate of mortality, and people per month that are dying, revenue in dollars per month, how quickly our revenue, our spending rate or burn rate is in dollars per month, common expression of how quickly we're going through money. Power is measured in watts, right? These are all flows. These are all flows that we're dealing with here. If we wanted to integrate them up over time, we get the corresponding integral. And so, cumulated revenue, which would be in dollars, the total amount that's been spent, dollars. Accumulate up over watts, we might get joules. So here we have stocks, which are these quantities we can measure at an instant in time, the position of a car. We have flows, changes that drive changes to those stocks, say associated with the velocity of a car. And we're going to see that jointly, those two determine evolution of the system. Now the thing that's interesting here is the stocks depend on the flows, and the flows depend on the stock. At any one time, the flows will be determined by the values of the stocks for that point in time. Okay? So the stocks totally describe the state of the system. They will dictate the flows. How the stock changes over a given period of time is dictated by the values of the flow into it for that point in time, which in turn depend on the stocks at that point in time. So the number of people who are getting infected at a given point in time is going to be associated with this flow. So how many people get infected in a given week, and that depends on the number of people who are susceptible to infection on the one hand, and the number of people who are spreading infection on the other. So that's going to lead to the change that will lower the number of susceptible people. So in short, the derivatives depend on the values of the state variables. And the state variables, how they change over time, depends on the derivatives. Those who have taken differential equations course will recognize this pattern. There's nothing too mysterious about it. So with flows, we can ask conceptually about the rate at a given point in time, and it typically will change over time. But the rate of the Saskatchewan River we could ask right now, give me an estimate of how many cubic meters per second are flowing past Saskatoon. You can give me a rate, and that rate will be changing. I can assure you that in spring, at the time of snow melt, it'll be a lot larger than it is right now. Certain times, I think late summer, it will be quite low. It's going to change over time. We can speak about it having a value at one point in time, but it's hard to measure that. To measure it, we'd have to typically talk about some sort of accumulation over time. So when we talk about rates for flows, we typically mean a rate of change over time, something measured as x per unit time, as we said. So be aware, though, that not all things called rates are in fact flows. There are exceptions. By and large, there's a lot that are flows, but for example, an exchange rate, how many US dollars per Canadian dollar? That's not associated with amount per unit time. An interest rate is what percent of a certain amount of money in the bank do you get, back for interest per year. That's an interest rate. It is a rate. It's measured in some amount per unit time, a fraction per unit time. And there's some others as well, a so-called prevalence rate. Okay, so how to distinguish stocks and flows? If you're thinking about a system and you want to describe it with stocks and flows, there's a couple ways you can do this. One is to use a snapshot test. If you were to consider a moment in time, could the quantity be clearly, could it be quantified by the information available at that moment? You might not have access to that information, but could it in principle be quantified? So the location of a car, could that be quantified? Yes. Could the speed of the car be figured out if you could just freeze things at a moment in time? No. Could the rate at which water is coming into your bathtub be determined from an instant in time? No. Could the height of that bathtub be determined, the amount of water in the bathtub? Yes, from that moment in time. Distinguish between stocks and flows here. There's a time unit test. If you were to change the unit of time from, say, weeks to years, or days to years, would the numeric value of the quantity change? If so, then it's likely to be a flow. So if I were to talk, how fast is the Saskatchewan River flowing? And you were to tell me 200,000, would it matter if this was measured in a year or per day or per year? Yeah, it would measure quite a lot. 200,000 what? If I said, okay, I'm going to pay you $1 to work for me. Your salary is going to be $1. You would reasonably ask me, well, okay, $1 per what? $1 per year? $1 per second? There'd be substantial difference. So that's associated with a flow. It matters what time unit you're talking about. So it's quite likely to be a flow here. Accumulation test. This is quantity and accumulation at time varying values of other quantities. If yes, it's a stock. Now, these are rough and ready rules. You're going to find if you start building models of physical systems that some things don't fit quite so neatly into this. For example, if we wanted a model which had position, velocity, acceleration. The latter two, though not the first, the latter two, velocity and acceleration, are going to depend, the numeric value sure is better, it's going to depend on the time. And yet you might describe velocity as being a stock when compared to the flow of acceleration. But for a lot of models, these are going to hold true. The time unit test, if it shows no dependence on time, it's a sure sign it's a stock. If it shows dependence on time, it still could be a stock if it functions in that way with respect to another variable. But if it doesn't depend on time, pretty good chance it's a stock. So here's some exercise. Stocks or flows. Okay, account balance. Is that a stock or a flow? Stock. We can measure it, we can quantify it. At a certain point in time, exactly what is it? Okay, how about income? Flow. Yeah, for the reasons we talked about. My income is $1. Is that a lot? Is it little? Depends over what period of time. Yeah.
Will we be dealing with simulations that might
that's what I had alluded to there, that, for a lot of models, these are good rules, but when we deal with something like velocity, a situation where we're dealing with multiple levels, essentially derivatives, then we have velocity acceleration. Velocity in that case would be a stalk, even though it doesn't pass the time unit test. Okay, it does depend on time. How we quantify velocity, if it's 10, is it 10 meters per second or 10 meters per year? It's going to matter. And yet it's going to be, in that case, a stalk. So if it doesn't depend on time, pretty good indication it may be a stalk. If it does depend on time, it still could function as a stalk in some cases, but you're going to have to think through that issue. So you're absolutely right. And I tried to allude to that, but may not have been careful how I phrased it. Okay, incidents. If we talk about the rate at which people are getting sick, is that a stalk or a flow? I gave way. It's a rate. It's a rate. Yes. How about temperature? Okay, it's associated with a stalk. Actually, there's some thermodynamics issues here that I won't go into with heat and etc. So I won't go into there, but we could quantify it at a given point in time, and we could talk about how temperature changes over time in a quantifiable way, etc. Loss of change in temperature as a door opens, so it drops down to mid level, what have you. Births. If I said Saskatoon has one birth, wow, we have lots of births, so we have one birth. What would you have to ask? Per day, per year? We are a growing town. We have one birth. Well, per day, that's still not that much, but okay. Per second, yeah, that would be a lot, man. It will be growing. Profits? I earned a buckload of profit. Okay, yeah, it's a flow. Interest? Boy, my bank, I'm doing well. I got a buck. It's a flow. You gotta ask. Okay, well, $1 per what? How about the principal? The amount that's in a bank account. Wow, kind of balance, right? Shipments. Flow. How about car accidents? Flow. How about number of patients who are, say, on dialysis, like in a hospital or in a facility at one time? Yeah, kind of gave it away at one time. Yeah. Deaths, heart attacks. Okay, flows. Number of police. Stock. Yeah. Patients in a hospital. Position. Okay. And this is designed to. Yeah.
You said shipments was a flow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean.
Yeah. The time test, I guess.
Yes. Now you could actually represent like shipments in transit, like the count of shipments in transit right now. But if you're talking about it, sort of how many, how many items are we getting? How frequently are we getting items in, or something like that? Then it would be a flow. Okay, so let's talk about these. So in a causal loop diagram sense, we'd have a relationship between a flow and a stock, a flow into a stock like this. A flow would be connected with a positive polarity to a stock. So all of the things being equal, if the flow were to increase, the stock would increase compared to the value it would have otherwise had. So if we have the water coming in faster to our bathtub, all of the things being equal, the bathtub's water level will be higher than it would have been. Okay? So in that sense, there's a relationship. But what you'll see here is that this diagrammatic notation associated with causal loop diagrams is not nearly as specific as the diagram, the understanding from stocks and flows, because this is a very specific sort of relationship. A flow to a stock has semantic connotations, has semantic implications that go beyond what we can describe in a causal loop diagram. So it's true that increasing the flow is going to increase the stock compared to the flow into a stock. It's going to increase that stock compared to the value it would have otherwise had. But it's going to do so in a very specific way, and we're going to talk about that. It has to do with the nature of accumulation. Okay, so let's talk about the impact of a flow on a stock. So if we have a flow into a stock, and we have a stock and it starts at some value, and the flow in is constant, the value of that stock is going to rise, and it's going to rise linearly. There's no other flow out of that stock, just this flow in. The stock's going to rise. Think of the water coming into your bathtub at a fixed rate, 10 liters per minute. It's coming into your bathtub. Your bathtub's going to be rising. The amount of water in your bathtub is going to be rising steadily. Now, what would happen? Right now we're showing this flow rate as being 10 cubic meters per month. What if we were to lower it to 5 cubic meters per month? What would be the impact on that stock, the dynamics of the stock, how it changes over time? Suppose we were to lower that rate halfway through to a lower value, halve its value. How would that stock change? Okay. And slope would be less, starting at the point, what? So suppose this changed at time 50 to be half its value, down to 5. Where would this start to change? Okay, and how big would the change in the value of the stock be at that moment in time? 0. And the slope would be less, so when would the gap be the largest? It would be largest at between the two values, the value it would have had and the value it has with that lower flow. Where is it the largest? The gap between them. Well, it's largest over here to the right, so we have something like that. So I'm trying to communicate here some of the special implications when we have a flow in stock compared to just this. I mean, at a level of abstraction, flow to stock in a causal loop diagram is a much higher level of relationship, higher level of abstraction. It does not describe how this variable here at the distal end changes when you change the variable at the proximal end. Doesn't describe over time how it's changed, how quickly, how abruptly. When we have a flow in a stock, we have this very specific relationship. The stock is an accumulation of the flow. We're dealing with the derivative changing the derivative of a state variable. And it changes over time in this sort of way. So a change in the flow does not effect a big change instantaneously, right? It doesn't affect the stock immediately in a pronounced way. It effects a change over time. And it turns out that this is one of the reasons why loops have a time constant associated with them. It takes some time. All loops, it turns out, all causal loops, will ultimately involve a stock. They involve changing the state, because changing the state is the only way subsequently flows are changed. And it takes time to change the state. Loops have time constants associated with them. And those time constants will dictate whether a loop rises exponentially, say a reinforcing loop rises exponentially, at very, very steep rates initially or more slowly, takes time to take off. Eventually they'll all be going up exponentially, but they'll be going up at different sort of rates of speed, getting going. Stocks only change by changes to the flows in and out. So there's no inputs that immediately change stocks. So the population of Saskatoon changes via immigration, emigration, deaths, and births. And you don't see instantaneous, and by immigration, I'm including people visiting and so on. And you're not going to see it instantly change without one of those processes playing out. All causal loops involve at least one stalk, and the state of the world must change as part of that. Absent a stalk, the loop is instantaneous. Whoa, okay, I don't know why that was in there. So let's talk about some other elements. Another element within these models is what's called auxiliary variables. And what we'll see here, and I provided this on the Moodle site. If you want to go download it, you can do so. This diagram is there under System Dynamics Models on the main page. And what you'll see here are stalks and flows, to be sure. But you'll also see some other variables. For example, there'll be a fractional overtime sought by manager, a production rate, error generation rate. These are what we call auxiliary variables. And at a mathematical level, they are simply convenience names for certain formulas involving stocks. Okay? They really boil down to, if you really get down to it and collapse them all, you could collapse them into a formula involving a stock. However, they are convenience names that let us name them in a meaningful way in terms of how we think about them as a concept. Okay, and different models will see different things. So, for example, in this model here, we might have total population as a auxiliary variable. It's a convenient name for the sum of number of susceptible, infectious, and temporarily immune people, because that's the entire population. We might sum those up to yield the total population. Convenient. We can refer to this as the population size. Particularly valuable if you had these changing over time. People are dying or what have you, or being born. That might be changing over time. But it's nothing more than the sum of susceptible, infectious, and recovered, and temporarily immune. Similarly, the prevalence of infection might be the number of infectious people divided by the size of the total population. The fraction of that population that's infectious we call the prevalence. Some people call it a prevalence rate, but it's an abuse of the term. So here, we have a simple notation for a formula. We call it prevalence of infection, the number of infectious over the total population. In other words, number of infectious over the number of susceptible plus infectious plus recovered plus temporarily immune in the denominator. So it's a convenient name we use for that. And it's important as far as the software engineering of these are concerned. As far as kind of reasoning these things through, it can be very, very valuable to give it a name that's familiar, because it means something. It has some connotation. At a mathematical level, though, it is not of significance in terms of the system dynamics. It's really what we're dealing with is functions of these stocks and flows. And when we look at the differential equations, we will see that these values, these auxiliary values, fall out. They don't have to be captured. They're simply convenient things so that we can deal with it comfortably as people. So auxiliary variables are on these convenience names. Adding or eliminating auxiliary variable doesn't change the mathematical structure if we're just replacing one formula by giving it a name. For the same formula. They're critical for model transparency, and typically we use them at many places. And often we'll go inspect them. We'll ask questions about what is total population doing over time, or what's the prevalence of infection, or what's the error fraction right now, what fraction of all work being done is introducing errors, etc. So they're critical for model transparency and for understanding what's going on with the model. They provide enhanced modifiability. They're abstractions. It provides a single place to define things. A single place to define some quantity that otherwise might be used in many, many places. So, for example, in this model, it's not a good example, but the total population is used only once here. But we may have in other models certain quantities being used. Say fatigue here is being referred to, that's not a great example. Production rate is being referred to at two separate places here. So this variable here is being referred to here and here. And it is clearer if we can give it a name and show that both of these depend on this name, which has a clear set of units associated with it, a clear semantics associated with it, maybe a notion of how it can be measured in the real world, we show that it depends on this rather than simply making this variable here ultimately just mathematically dependent on the things that production rate depends upon. So in short, giving these things names is a use of abstraction that is very, very useful for enhancing transparency within our diagrams. As I said, it's a convenient place for reporting. We can graph it, we can look at tables. So for example, within Vensim here, and I'd welcome any of you to follow along here, if you load this model in, you could double click on production rate, and we can look at how production rate is changing over time with various scenarios. If we make various assumptions about, say, how long it takes to discover bugs within our model, how much overtime are we working, we might look at the implications on production rate. Here you'll notice that high amounts of overtime initially lead to higher productivity, but soon slide down below the level of productivity that would otherwise be obtained. And ultimately, they lead the team to be less productive with this this red line here. Okay, so here we've seen auxiliary variables. We'll also, for similar reasons, we'll give names to other variables for things like time series and model constants. And I think I have those shown here. So we might have initial population, the probability of transmission when two people meet up, one infected, one not. What's the probability there's a transmission event? Here in this model, we might have some amount of initial work to be done. We might have some specification of the normal amount of daily time that's required for people, say as measured as some unit, or maybe it could be measured in hours per day. What's the sustainable daily production rate, etc. These might be quantitative assumptions in the form of values that we'd introduce into the model. Okay, not going to comment on that, but I will note this, that not all things within these models are of the same units. So not all stocks have to do with the same type of quantity. So here we have stocks associated with people. This might accumulate the total number of illnesses that have occurred. There might be another stock which would be the total costs which have been incurred. Others might be the total number of people who have died. In this model here associated with software development, we might accumulate a stock associated with fatigue, measuring something about fatigue levels within individuals, which you'd be surprised to find if you go look at the literature, has been quantified quite well. Sort of how to measure fatigue. How do you quantify a level of fatigue? There's tests that seek to do that. So there are some models where you'll have very, very different types of stocks. For example, these stocks keep track of the number of birds at different periods of age, different levels of infection, number of mosquitoes here in Saskatchewan, and number of humans at different stages. So this is a model for West Nile, which is a significant problem within our province. When we introduce stocks and flows, we are working towards a fully quantifiable specification of our assumptions, which we can then run. We can simulate over time. With causal diagrams, even though they include qualitative elements, we can't simulate them over time. There's just not enough specificity, not enough precision in how we describe things to allow us to simulate. We saw earlier, if we go back to that slide here, that there's a lot of wiggle room in this link between flows and stocks. We're not nailing down the nature of this relationship. We know that if we increase flows, stocks will increase compared to the value it otherwise would have had, but we don't know how soon, how much, in what way, how instantaneously, etc. With stocks and flows, we can get to that point. We can precisely specify the dynamics in a way that happens also to be graphical, happens also to be quite to be quite mathematically tractable for analysis. Okay, I want to talk about a combination called the system structure diagram, just very briefly highlighting this, where we combine actually elements of, on the one hand, stocks and flows, on the other, causal loop diagrams, okay? The idea here is that we actually represent in stocks and flow diagrams causal loops, okay? So the key point here, and this is a quizzable point, testable point, is that within a stock and flow diagram, there are going to be some loops that are obvious and some loops that are not so obvious, okay? So this diagram is attempted to show in graphical form, using the conventions of system structure diagrams, the presence of flows, and to highlight negative flows and positive flows. And I'd like you to help reason through this with me. So some of these flows are more obvious than others. One example would be this flow up here, up in the upper right. Can anyone try to walk through at an intuitive level what this flow might represent? Just try to get some experience reading this sort of diagram. So if we have some count of people who are infective, what is this flow? What is this flow positing, or what does it represent? Is some assumption about what process that might affect the spread of infection? Just walk step by step through this flow. Who's up for that?
More people infected.
Yes.
More people have are waiting for the diagnosis.
Yeah.
The more time they have to wait for the recovery.
Yeah.
The more time they have to wait for recovery.
Yeah.
The less recovery.
Good. So the lower the rate of recoveries. So if you have to wait longer, if you've got 100 people waiting for treatment and they're waiting a longer period of time, the number of people getting treated per day is lower, than it otherwise would have been per hour. They're waiting up, and there's lower rates of recoveries. We have a greater number of infections, and these certain number of infectives are waiting over a longer period of time to get treated. Okay, so that's those sort of pathological thing. We might queue up to get treated of this bug, and because it's going to take us extra long to get our treatment, we may spread it in the meantime. It's a quite real phenomenon for some types of infections, not least gonorrhea. I kid you not. It's been studied in England.
I
So.
think maybe if you explain to class why you looked at me and said gonorrhea rather than having any sort of other implication.
Sorry, Alex. Let's all give him a clap.
You can clap.
So Alex is working on a software development project where they're grappling with the gonorrhea problem. So they're building a database for someone who's a researcher here on campus on gonorrhea to help researchers across the world fight this very nasty bug, about which they are just learning now. They have had no previous experience. They've just been learning about the importance of gonorrhea and the fact that it needs to be treated to be eradicated from a person. As such, the longer the amount of time it takes to get treated, the longer the wait is, the more a person will be circulating to spread it potentially, and the more it can spread. So their team is helping to advance research against this bug, but in the meantime, this helps describe some of the dynamics associated with its spread, which have been documented among other places in England. In this case, we have a system structure diagram which captures that loop. And this is a fairly obvious loop at first blush. You see it going around. But what's the final link of this loop? What's the final link? How many negative polarity things does this loop have that are obvious here? So Remember the rule, how do we determine the polarity associated with a loop? Okay, multiply the signs. How many negative signs are obvious here? Okay, so why is it a positive loop? Does it make sense that it's positive to you? The longer people wait, the bigger the number of infectives, so fewer people recovering per day, and therefore the larger the stock should be, and therefore the longer the wait. It kind of makes sense, so that's a good sign. But where's the final negative here? Exactly. So there is actually a link here, which may not be obvious, but it's along here. This rate is draining the number of infectives. So the larger the number of recoveries, how does that change the number of infectives compared to the value it otherwise would have had? If you have more recoveries per unit time, it leads infectives to be, well, think about it. If we had 100 people with measles, and we had fewer people recovering from measles than, per unit time, say per day, the number of people who still have measles would be greater or lesser than it otherwise would have been. If we have some number of people with measles and the number of people actually recovering per day is lower, then the number of people with measles would be larger or smaller than it otherwise would have been. Larger. Yes. So if we have fewer recoveries, it's larger. If we have more recoveries, it is smaller. Larger? Okay. Let's think this through.
I got it until I didn't know what your question was.
Okay. Right. Okay. So if we have more recoveries going on, remember.
Smaller number of effective.
Okay. Yeah. So if to figure out, we're trying to figure out the polarity from recoveries on the one hand. Conceptually, there's a link between recoveries on the one hand and infectives on the other. And we could, if we diagram this in a causal link sort of way, as we increase the number of recoveries, would the number of infectious individuals go down or up compared to the value it would have had? We're trying to associate polarity associated with this link. So as we increase the rate of recoveries, so we go from 10 people per day to 100 people per day recovering from measles, would the number of infectious individuals go up or down compared to what it otherwise would have been? It'll go down. Okay, so it's a negative link. The fact that this flow is flowing out of infectives, the larger the flow is, it's just like your drain. This is like your bathtub. This is your flow into your bathtub, infections. So that's the number of infections per day. The number of recoveries per day is like your draining, the rate of draining of your bathtub. The faster it drains, the lower your bathtub's going to be, all other things being equal. So there's a negative link associated with this flow, as David said. So, if you look along here, there's a negative link. And that's the other component of this. That's the negative link because it's a flow out of this. Does that make sense to people? The larger the flow out is, the smaller the stock is going to be. In a very special way. It's not just any old linkage like you diagram in a causal loop diagram. It's a very special, semantically significant linkage here. Okay, so we have that, and that makes it a positive feedback loop associated with that. The more people are infected, the more people are waiting, the longer they gotta wait, the longer the time till they recover, and therefore the longer they're gonna be kept infective, and by implication, the more contacts they're gonna have in the meantime. They're gonna be spreading measles. Let's talk about some of these other loops. There's a similar loop here in this first one. Number of susceptibles. Who can walk through this first one here? Number of susceptibles and contacts between susceptibles and infectives. So can anyone narrate sort of what's going on? Why is this a balancing loop here? Why is that a balancing loop?
The more susceptible you have, the more contact with
Okay.
something infected you have.
Yeah.
The more infections you have.
Yeah.
I think means the less susceptible you have.
Yeah.
Because infections doesn't flow out.
Exactly. So this is draining the number of susceptibles. It tends to pull the number of susceptibles down towards zero. If this loop continued on, eventually there's gonna be no susceptibles, and that's it. It's like the fire. This is like a fire burning its fuel. At some point, it's gone through its fuel. It can't continue burning. Does that make sense? Okay. And similarly for some of these other
There's
loops.
one other relationship.
Yes.
That's obvious.
Okay.
From number of recovers.
Yes.
We have a negative impact on the rating.
Okay.
So.
So, okay, yes. Right. So, number for okay. This is actually this should be a plus.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for spotting that. This should be a plus here. So as the number of recovereds go up, the number of people, the rate at which people gain immunity goes up. So there's more people per month who are waning in immunity, and the lower recovers will be. Does that make sense? So that's why it's a negative thing. Okay. So we're going to go through this. Okay, let's talk about just some stocks and flows associated with software development. I actually showed these slides in 371 a couple lectures ago. This is sort of a bug resolution pipeline in software development. Undiagnosed bugs, bug reports, active bugs, important bugs, bugs assigned to different developers, bugs believed fixed, feedback for certain things that may be discovered to be unfixed, resolved, and closed. We could characterize actually sort of the life cycle of defects in this sort of quite articulated way if we wanted to. And we could estimate the number of bugs that are flowing along here, and over time, there's going to be, bugs coming in here through reports. These are identification new reports, and they're going to come through, and eventually more and more are going to be closed over time, and it's going to be accumulated. Yes?
That symbol right below the new bugs flow, that's occurred a few times. What does that mean?
So
Just above the source here?
this thing?
Yes.
Oh,
Is that just an unknown or unquantified?
Yes, it has an unseemly or sort of resemblance to Australia without the Cape York Peninsula. But it's supposed to represent a cloud. Sort of it's coming from outside the model.
Oh, it's outside the system.
We're not paying attention to where it is. We're not paying attention, and also sometimes you'll see things going out to a cloud. So they're going outside the scope of the model. The flow goes out, and we don't really pay attention to where it goes. It's not really of our concern. Okay. So here, where new bugs are coming from, we're abstracting over. We might, in a more complete model, actually keep track of this, because, for example, some of these bugs might be from design defects, others might be from requirements defects, and we might actually want to more flesh out where all these things are coming from. But in this particular model, it's sort of outside the scope of the model. Does that make sense? So that particular derivative, it's increasing this state variable, but it's not draining any state variable. Yeah.
There's a flow from stock A to stock B. Does that mean necessarily that an increase in the
Yeah.
flow will cause A to decrease
Yes.
and B to increase?
There's a conservation.
Okay.
There's a conservation effect. This is actually really important, and I'm grateful for you. Is it Yvonne? Yeah. Yvonne for bringing this up. When we have a flow going from A to B, there's conservation. So if that's all there is between A and B, A plus B will remain constant, right? And if you had purely A flows to B and we total up A and B over time, it'll be constant. Just the larger and larger fraction, assuming the flow is known, is greater than or equal to 0, a larger or greater than 0, a larger and larger fraction will be in stock B. Does that make sense? So these are derivatives of these, but there's conservation going on. So testing, a larger value of testing here, down here on the lower left-hand side, that's going to lead simultaneously to a higher negative part of the derivative of undiagnosed bugs and a higher positive part of the derivative here into to bug reports. So, when it comes to software development, we have many types of stocks and flows. I mean, it's a matter of, and I want to bring us back to that reminder of the software development process. We have to think about what our question is that we're bringing to bear. And for different models of the software development process, you might be investigating different problems and therefore have different stocks. Some models, for example, have looked at this issue of rookie developers and seasoned developers. The idea being looking at the productivity impacts of bringing people aboard a project where the very process of interviewing, the process of hiring, the process of training, the process of correcting for the new arrivals, the rookie developers, takes time away from the seasoned developers. So you have a core of, say, 4 people, and you bring on board, 8 new rookies. There's going to be a big drop in productivity initially, because it's no fault of the rookies. It's just, they have to undergo training. They have to learn the ropes. They have to be mentored and have their bugs corrected and so on. So this rookie seasoned developers has been the focus of, have some very interesting models. Flows associated with hiring, leaves of absence and layoffs, for example, affect developers. And very importantly, these are not just arbitrary numbers over time that fluctuate stochastically. These are driven by things. So hiring is typically driven by shortfalls in people, perceived shortfall given where you at are in a project. Sometimes by the fact we're behind, so we hire to try to speed us up, as big a mistake as that sometimes is. That does go on. Layoffs or resignations, leaves of absence, those are driven by things. Those are driven by low morale. Those are driven by, burnout. These are things that drive these dynamics, and they're endogenous. These are endogenous features, if we wish to characterize them as such, aspects of the process. When we're really, really behind, morale is low, quality is low, we're thrashing, you're more likely to have people leave, you're more likely to fall further behind. We talked about some of those vicious cycles before. The point is there's dynamics driving these things that are based on regularities. There's dynamics associated with productivity, work to be done, work items, tasks, as it were. So, for example, the work planned, the work accomplished, work discarded, discarded code because of design change or requirements change. Fatigue is another thing that really substantially impacts things. Active defects at different levels, undiagnosed defects, and there can be flows associated with testing and peer reviews, finding defects, work accomplished, fixing defects, etc. So this model that I provided to you on the website, I suggest that you play around with it. In remaining minutes is fine. Also at home before next class. But basically, what we have is we have a stock of fatigue, which is accumulating values. We have some amount of work, which initially starts as known work remaining, and then over time actually gets completed. But the problem is that some of the work, when it's being done, has mistakes in it. And instead of being completed, there's undiagnosed work, undiscovered work that will have to be done. It's just not known that it has to be done yet. So often you have this illusion of great progress, but really what's going on is a larger and larger stock of undiagnosed work is being piled up in the meantime because you haven't diagnosed it yet. And then at some point that gets discovered, and how quickly you discover it turns out to be one of the key questions. And it becomes known work remaining again. You've discovered, oh, there are these problems. We got to fix them. And so you've had this kind of multiplication of work. You've done work, but it's been done wrong. And now you have more work to be done to fix it. And you've had this illusion that you've made progress, but now you realize, okay, you're further behind. And over time, you do more and more work. This value gets less and less. Now, what becomes really a problem is fatigue. If the work is being pushed really hard and there's high amounts of overtime, you may get fatigue, and that ends up impacting the production rate, but also most critically the error generation rate. How much? What fraction of the work that you do actually has defects in it? And this fraction is can be quite high. People have done studies of bug fixing and found that the number of defective bug fixes can be very large. It can be 30%. 1 out of every 3 bugs you try to fix, you end up actually introducing another defect. Now, that doesn't seem like a bad thing in and of itself. After all, 2/3 you fix. The problem is what? What is often the real problem with that? Okay, so 2/3 of the bugs you fix, and so a third you reintroduce, you just go fix it. What's the problem?
That's just one thing. Leaving bugs that other people might have to fix.
Yeah, okay. So you've mentioned a couple of things there. One thing is there's an opportunity cost. It's taking you away from doing something else, like introducing new features and so on. So that's a significant thing, that 1/3 left. Someone else might have to fix it, may be less qualified than you, and therefore it'll take longer. But often there's an even more important thing for the dynamics of it. When will that bug that you reintroduce get discovered? Typically there'll be a delay, quite a delay. And it may not get discovered till after it's being used by the user. It may not just get discovered till weeks from now. And so it just drags things out hugely. If you want to be confident that you've caught the bugs, that were introduced by this latest round of bug fixes, that you intended to be just before ship time, then you've got quite a bit of waiting to do, because the testing has got to go through this. You've got to run a whole bunch of regression tests. You've got to run a whole set of system-wide tests and automated tests on the UI. And it's going to take a while before those bugs show their face. And then you've got to go through and sanitize them. Sanitization being, okay, is this something that's just due to an updated report from an earlier version? Is it a duplicate of a bug that's already known, etc.? And that's actually a lot of work associated with those 1/3 bugs that you introduced, and it drags things out hugely. So this time of discovering rework, when we cause another bug, it sits here for some period of time before we drain it. So, I played around some just before class. I created this a couple years back for a book talking about software project dynamics. And, you can play around with a couple of things. One thing to be aware in Vensim is there are some things that can be hidden by default, so you can actually hide some components of a model and show them. So in this case, I'm showing everything associated with this model. And you can tweak some parameters. One thing you can do, for example, is adjust the level of work that's required by a manager. So, for example, here the sprint definition, how frequently you're in a sprint. So in some of these cases, I have the manager just demanding large amounts of overtime. Other small amounts, other no overtime at all. And then you can look at the impact on fatigue here, where fatigue rises if someone's working beyond their normal hours. And it can rise up and plateau at certain rates associated with sort of maxing out of individuals. So we assume there's some sort of fatigue half-life, which could itself change over time. And then there's an error generation rate. So there's an impact of these things, like an error fraction as a function of fatigue. So how does the amount of fatigue someone has end up impacting their error rates, and how does it impact their productivity rates? And what you'll see is that there's quite interesting dynamics associated with this. This is the amount of work remaining, for example, under different situations. So we have some amount of work which we have to do initially, and you might expect that it gets done very steadily. The problem is, and blue is the baseline here, the problem is if you start demanding a lot of overtime, for example, you end up having a situation where the amount of work is drained much less quickly because the production rate is actually significantly lower than it otherwise would have been. You have this initial spike of productivity associated with longer hours, and then it drains down below the normal production rate. But what's more of an issue is that the rate of rework, the work that's being introduced, undiscovered rework, gets much larger because of the larger number of mistakes that are being made. And that ends up accumulating here, and that's extra work to be done. So if we were to look at the total amount of work being done over time, the actually completed work, we can see essentially having larger amounts of overtime really drags out a project. It makes them slower to do the work and much longer amount of time to converge. In these other cases, say the baseline, you go up at a steady rate, and then there's some rework to be fixed and so on. This is kind of getting it towards feature complete. You're actually implementing the major parts of the system, and then there's some bugs to be fixed, and this drags out over a longer period of time. If you start demanding modest amounts of overtime, you'll rise up and actually reach this point where you're essentially feature complete, but you're fixing bugs for a much longer amount of time till convergence. And if you demand large amounts of overtime, well, it really drags things out here. So just to familiarize yourself with Vensim, there's a couple elements to use, and I'll refer you to a video that's online that will provide more details, but a couple sort of heads up on this. First of all, you'll see, and I think the interface for your version is slightly different, but there's going to be an equations button up here that will let you see the equations associated with each component. So for example, you'll see this rate of work being finished, this variable here, being associated with some production rate minus the error generation rate. The idea is the production rate some of it goes into finishing actual work, some goes into actually generation of errors. And you can go and you can look at the various equations here. There's moreover some buttons here which will let you move things around without changing things. Some buttons that will allow you to introduce new variables or new stock variables or new auxiliary variables here, draw new flows, etc. So we'll be using this a little bit within the next lecture or two. But in the meantime, it's worth sort of poking around. You'll notice that stocks within Vensim are depicted graphically like this, but there's an equation here which specifies the integral. So fatigue, for example, is the integral of increase in fatigue coming in minus fatigue elimination. So in essence, this is the derivative, and we're saying fatigue is the integral of that. Fatigue is the integral of this rate of flow coming in minus that rate of flow going up. Those are the two elements that collectively compose the derivative of fatigue. Put another way, the derivative d fatigue dt equals increase in fatigue minus fatigue elimination. Yep. Yeah, so it's a good question. So you may recall from other classes, including differential equations, that if we're dealing with ordinary differential equations being where time is the only continuous variable of interest, as opposed to x and y as you might have with partial differential equations, for example. If we have ordinary differential equations, if we're interested in higher order derivatives, so if we're interested in, dx squared, dt squared, if we're interested in a second derivative of x, say, or d squared x, dt squared, second derivative of x, we can express that actually as using only first order derivatives, as you could have y being dx dt, and then deal with dy dt also. So in other words, we can re-express higher order derivatives as series of lower order derivatives, and that's how you do it here. So if we wanted to have, and let me just do this in front of you. If I want to have a new model, sure, I'll save that, and I want to have, let's say, position, right? For the engineers in the audience, position. I'm just creating this through this, and then I might have, velocity be a derivative to position, right? Now I'm going to call this actually for to make it a bit clearer, I'm going to call it change in position, and then I will create another variable called velocity, and that will be a stalk, and then I'll have a change in that called acceleration, right? And this goes to David's question earlier, so I'm going into this in a little bit more detail. I'm going to link this up to change in position. And so change in position here will just be equal to velocity. Okay. And then I could assume anything I want. So I'll make the initial position 0, make the initial velocity 0, and I'll have, say, an initial acceleration of 1, and then I can simulate this out, and I'll see, okay, position is rising, as you might expect with the square of acceleration. And within Vensim, it turns out you can do some further things. So, for example, you can modify your assumption about acceleration. It will actually respond interactively. You can, moreover, create interactive elements. For example, I could have an output tool here, which I want to depend, on the position, and I will therefore have it depend on the position, and I want to have this as a graph. Okay. So this would provide me a way of sort of graphically showing this as I modify it. Can run this like this, and and then as I modify that, I could see, okay, it's changing position. In a toy model like this, it may not seem very desirable, but when you have many possible things you can change, it's actually very handy to experiment with these and get a sense of their impact on behavior. So to be clear what's going on here, here we have two stalks, position and velocity. Change in position is actually just another name for velocity. In fact, the definition of it is precisely the same as velocity. So what we're saying is that the derivative of position, as given by the name change in position, is velocity, and the derivative of that is the acceleration. This is an exception to that rule that stocks are typically not going to depend on time. The units of velocity will depend on time. And a given number there, 1, to have a meaning associated with that, you have to specify a time unit. But here we have a multi-level model that illustrates. I shouldn't say multi-level model. Here we have a second-order derivative, essentially, captured within the model as a series of first-order derivatives. And that's the typical way of capturing something like that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, any other questions about this right now? Stocks and flows. I've done this on Vensim here. You will find that AnyLogic gives you just about the same interface. And AnyLogic's representation of stocks and flows is very similar. It's a little bit less easy to use, and I wanted to expose you to Vensim before diving into that, because in Vensim it's just a little bit easier to kind of get your feet wet and start using this interactively. We'll do more work with AnyLogic, and we'll see how AnyLogic stocks and flows can be integrated, in fact, with our other sorts of modeling. So we can have these mixed types of methods, these hybrid methods, which involve stocks and flows, like here, and which involve agents, or which involve discrete events and process-centric modeling within a later lecture. But for now, it's a bit of an introduction to stocks and flows. I'm going to leave you with a question here. If here we have two flows, do I have a position? Yes, okay. Here's people without diabetes, people with diabetes. Here we have incident cases of diabetes. We have some flow coming in here and some flow going out here, deaths of people with diabetes. Maybe this is 10 people per month here, and this is 15 people per month coming in. If we have 15 people per month coming in and 10 people per month leaving, what's the impact on people with diabetes? What is that going to be doing over time? Okay, and it's going to be increasing in a what sort of way? Linear sort of way. Question is, what's going to happen if it decreases, if the inflow decreases in this vector? This is the outflow, 10. And suppose the inflow decreases from 15 to 5. Think about it. Think about it. It'll turn out to be quite helpful to develop some intuition with this when it comes to reasoning about some of the dynamics we'll be seeing. And suffice it to say that while it seems simple, and while I'm sure that a lot of you will get a very clear answer to it, it turns out people's intuitions with this are surprisingly poor. And people end up making mistakes when reasoning about complex systems. They end up making very, very simple mistakes in this sort of situation. So think through the answer, and we'll see some elaborations of it. We'll go through some exercises which will develop the intuitions further, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the common mistakes that people make when reasoning at this level. Okay? So Thursday, we'll be meeting at our normal time. Okay. Thanks for your flexibility, and we'll see you Thursday. And remember, I think with today's lecture, you probably can do the other two problems in the problem set. It's probably sufficient to complete the problem set at this